Thank you so much to everyone for joining us this evening. It's just turned 7 o'clock, and at this point, I'd like to hand over to Bishop James to lead us in some theological reflection and prayer. Bishop James.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm going to begin with a reading from Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews. It's chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such hostility against himself from sinners, so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. Well, reading that lovely passage from Hebrews again the other day reminded me of a story I once heard about a woman whose car stalled at a T-junction. Try as she might, she couldn't get it to start again, and the man in the car behind her began to hoot his horn in a very menacing and aggressive way. Well, this went on for some time until she finally switched off the ignition, got out of her car, and walked up to the car behind. She tapped on the driver's window, which he very slowly and rather apprehensively wound down. "Tell you what," she said, "you go and start my car for me, and I'll stay here and honk the horn for you." Well, that man's impatience has been echoed in some of the correspondence that I've been receiving during this period of lockdown. Trying to cope with all the uncertainties of this present time and confronted by the closure of church buildings and what's been called, rather aptly, I think, the incarnational deficit of endless Zoom meetings, some people have grown weary and begun to lose heart. And I absolutely understand all the frustration that they've been expressing. But at the same time, I think I've been hugely impressed by the remarkable patience that has been a hallmark of so many of our Christian communities right across Cumbria throughout this pandemic, just as it was a hallmark of the early church. So, prompted by the letter to the Hebrews, in which it's a recurring theme, I want to reflect briefly on what the Bible has to say about patience, not just as a quality or a virtue, but more a way of life as we run with perseverance the race that's set before us. The Great North Run has just sadly been cancelled, but the Christian journey, with all its ups and downs, has definitely not. Well, in the Old Testament, especially in Exodus and Numbers, patience is a word that's often used to describe God and his relationship with human beings. It's a vital aspect of his character, which is expressed most directly in and through the prophets of the building blocks of God's kingdom here on earth. We see that most obviously in Jesus, who endured many sufferings, we're told, including the cross, and who was endlessly patient with his disciples, despite his frustration with their slowness to believe. His teaching contained a great deal about patience, not least his parables, the parable of the unjust judge, the parable of the sower, the parable of the prodigal son. And St. Paul picked this up, for instance, in his classic passage on love in 1 Corinthians 13, familiar to all of us, in which he says that love endures all things. And that patience, the patience of God, is something that he shares with us. We love because he first loved us. In the same way, we can be patient because he is patient. And according to St. Paul, the patience of Christ can be and is shared with us through the Holy Spirit. In fact, patience, as we know, is one aspect of the so-called fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. And so it should be one aspect, one characteristic of any follower of Jesus. And that leads on to the whole question of the patience of the saints of which we're a part. In Ephesians chapter 4, we're urged to walk worthily of our calling, with patience, forbearing one another in love. And that means active engagement rather than passive resignation. It means trusting fully in God for the eventual outcome, even when everything seems to be going wrong. Christina Rossetti wrote a poem about that kind of endurance. You may know it. Does the road wind up the hill all the way? Yes, to the very end. Will the day's journey take the whole long day? From morn to night, my friend. Well, Clemmy Churchill sent that to her husband Winston on one occasion when he was on the very verge of giving up altogether. So being patient as a Christian means believing that God can and does bring good things out of bad. It's all there in Romans chapters 5 and 8. And it involves waiting on God for his timing rather than trying to rush through our own. It means hoping for signs of God at work around us and knowing that his hope doesn't disappoint us. And the purpose of all this patience that we're called on to express and demonstrate is precisely that it's what it takes, patience, if we are to be of service to those around us. Colossians 3. So, for instance, advising that churches which are open for private prayer should have a supervisor present is all about other people's safety, not about our preference or convenience. We're there to serve other people in the best possible way. One of the things which I think we've been reminded of in recent weeks is the central place service in and to the community has in our reason for existing as church in Cumbria. Jesus came not to be served, but to serve, and we are the same. And the result, the outcome of all this patience, learning to wait on God and to be patient, is a big step along the road to Christian maturity. It is a prerequisite both for being fruitful and for finding salvation in Christ. So while I certainly agree with all those who hope, and there are lots of them, who hope that we'll emerge from all of this kinder, I also pray that we'll have learned more about patience. And meanwhile, like Paul in 2 Thessalonians, I boast of you for your steadfastness and faith in all the afflictions that you are enduring. I'm going to say a couple of prayers. One of them is a prayer that's I'm using every day from Morning Prayer, Church of England, Common Worship, and it's a good prayer for this particular time. Keep us, good Lord, under the shadow of your mercy, in this time of uncertainty and distress. Sustain and support the anxious and fearful, and lift up all who are brought low, that we may rejoice in your comfort, knowing that nothing can separate us from your love, in Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen. The other prayer is a prayer which comes from the Church of South India. Some of us used to go over to Chennai when it was one of our link dioceses and know the Church of South India quite well. It's a big concern, the way in which the coronavirus is spreading throughout India and South America, another of our link dioceses. And this is a prayer from the Ecumenical Church of South India. Lord, grant us the help of the Holy Spirit in all our life and all our worship, and in this time of meeting together, that we may expect great things from you and attempt great things for you, and being one in you, may show to the world that you sent Jesus Christ our Lord, to whom with you and the Holy Spirit be all honor and glory, world without end. Amen. Well, that's the end of the first little bit of our synod. And the next bit is a brief report on the national and diocesan church situation in relation to COVID-19 and the response. And that's also me. So before we come on to taking a little look at Vision Refresh with Bishop Emma, I'll say just a little bit about what's been going on and the way in which the church nationally and locally is trying to respond to it. I think the first thing to say, I'm just going to try get a bit more light on my scene here. It doesn't seem to make a huge difference. The first thing to say is that there have been, from my point of view, a huge number of bishops' meetings by Zoom. We've had House of Bishops virtually every week, it seems. We've had regional bishops meeting again and again. We've had the College of Bishops, which is all the bishops meeting. I tell you, 100 bishops on a big screen is not good. And I think we've developed a new doctrine now, which should be part of the canons of the Church of England instead of justified by faith, but just justification by Zoom nowadays. And that's beginning to take over. And I think as a consequence, quite a lot of people are getting quite tired, actually, because I don't know if it's your experience, certainly mine, that staring at a screen all day is exhausting. There have been quite a number of broadcast services nationally. Each Sunday, a Sunday programme on Radio 4. There's been a national service led by a variety of different people. And there've also been services which have been broadcast for all the local radio stations. And you may well have heard those on Radio Cumbria. And actually, in my view, they've been pretty good, generally speaking. We've had Thy Kingdom Come during this period and materials sent round to all the dioceses. And I think the kind of level of involvement and engagement has been absolutely fantastic in that, showing that even though the church's buildings may have been closed, the church has been very much active and alive, and people have been praying very hard. Everybody has been very conscious of the fact that mental health is going to be a big issue as we begin to emerge from all this. It's a big issue already. I've literally just 5 minutes ago come out of a seminar with the presidents of most of the royal colleges talking about COVID and mental health, and they were all, without exception, talking about a massive rise in anxiety and the worries that they've got about mental health, domestic abuse, and so on. Numbers up very considerably. And the whole thing of mental health has been picked up by Radio 4. We produced, because I'm quite involved with this as the lead bishop on health, we produced some materials on mental health, kind of thoughts for each day. And those were produced by somebody called Professor Chris Cook, who's up in Durham. And those have been picked up by Radio 4 and are being broadcast on a daily basis, which is really encouraging. During Mental Health Awareness Week, there was also an interview with the Archbishop of Canterbury. He talked very honestly about his own experience of mental well-being. And there was a Sunday service which was led by Gina Radford, who's working with us quite closely on all of this. She used to be Deputy Director of Public Health and is just an enormous help. She's now a self-supporting minister down in the south of England. The Church of England nationally has also established a so-called recovery group, which is chaired by the Bishop of London. I'm a member of it as lead bishop for health and social care, and it also includes all the conveners of the regional groupings of bishops. And that group meets fairly regularly. It's also set up several subgroups, of which I chair a couple. One is on mental health and well-being, both of clergy and we're looking at the ways in which they can help their congregations, and also the NHS. We're trying to respond to a rapidly changing situation. We have regular reports from somebody called Brendan McCarthy, who is the Church of England's advisor on health, who's in touch with the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Officer. And so we're fairly up to the minute on what's going on. And this particular group is ad hoc and temporary just until the end of the year. And one of the things it's doing is making decisions about the 3 phases of easing restrictions on the closure of churches. The first phase was clergy could go back into their own churches. We've had that phase. We're now into the second phase, which is the opening of churches for private prayer, suitably supervised or suitably safe at the least, and funerals, not only now by the graveside and in crematoria, but also with limited numbers in churches. That's phase 2. Phase 3, which will involve the opening of churches for public worship, again on a limited basis, has yet to come. We're looking at July, hopefully, for that. We are working quite closely with the government to try and encourage them to allow weddings with limited numbers as well as funerals as soon as possible. But when that will happen remains to be seen. It is quite an interesting process, all of this, because we never know quite what's going to be announced. We're told that one thing is going to be announced, but what actually comes out tends to be slightly different. And this is confusing the civil servants somewhat. It's also causing some mixed messages, because one message goes out in advance of the announcement, then the announcement comes and we have to have another announcement. And so poor Dave has been on the receiving end of all of this and doing a great job. But we're doing our best. And the Church of England has also set up some further groups. One group is looking at vision and strategy, a new vision and strategy for the whole of the Church of England, just like we're doing in the diocese. And Bishop Emma is on that group. I don't know whether you've actually met yet, Emma. I think probably not. But
for the first time on Thursday.
First time on Thursday, there we are. But I do know that the 5 marks of mission are going to be fairly crucial to those discussions. The group is chaired by the new Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell. And so I think there will be quite a strong congruence, hopefully, with what we're doing here in the diocese, especially with Bishop Emma as one of the key players on the group. So that's really good. So once again, Cumbria leads the way and is wagging the tail of the Church of England. I mean, wagging the dog, where the tail, it's the dog. Whatever happens, we're in charge, basically, as always. There are also set up groups to look at finance, inevitably, because you'll be well aware, and we'll be coming on to all of this later from our own point of view, that many dioceses, and I mean many dioceses, were already in difficulties financially. And for some, the impact of the coronavirus is pushing them very close to the edge, if not over it. And you will have seen headlines probably about a cull of bishops. That was a little exaggerated, but there we are. You'll have seen headlines about Chelmsford Diocese and now Winchester cutting their stipendiary numbers of clergy by 20% at least over the next 18 months, which is fairly drastic. And so on and so on. And so there are groups looking at the financial implications from all of this, and that's an ongoing process. And of course, there are still many uncertainties about which we have yet to sort of ascertain answers to. That's the national scene. Everybody's rushing around trying to do as much as they can, but not always exactly clear quite what we can do at this stage other than develop scenarios. And from a diocesan point of view, we're also developing various scenarios for the future. And I will give you edited highlights of what's been going on here in Cumbria. Local churches, and you'll know this from your own experience, have been absolutely amazing at producing streamed and online worship. It's been happening all over the county. They've also been doing alpha courses online, Bible study groups, issuing prayer resources, and so on and so on. And the numbers who've been tuning in to these services have been remarkable. I think one has to treat quite a lot of statistics with a bit of a pinch of salt, because sometimes if you tune in for half a minute, you're counted in the numbers. And somebody who did some research into this recently discovered that actually of the hundreds who he thought had tuned into his service, only a very small number indeed had lasted more than 3.5 minutes. But nonetheless, a lot of people had been tuning in, and very large numbers would say that they have been praying, sometimes for the first time. There's been a huge amount of pastoral care going on, particularly by phone, and cards and so on have been dropped through the letterboxes of congregation members, often via pastoral teams. And people have been keeping in touch with everyone else week by week and having conversations that otherwise they probably would never have had, which has been very encouraging. There's been a lot of engagement with the wider community, frequently with churches working closely with other community groups. And that's been on things like food banks, but a whole variety of different projects, many of them very imaginative. Funerals have been taking place, as I was indicating, at the graveside and in the crematoria, and now in church. And as I mentioned, our churches, where it's possible, are now open for private prayer when it's safe for them to be open. Turning from local churches, and there are many other things going on there as well, to Church House, a significant proportion of employees in Church House, including many in the God for All team, have been furloughed under the government scheme. We've been maintaining essential services, including things like pay and clergy housing and so on. And a group of people, particularly Rick and Derek and others have been working very hard on possible future financial scenarios, given the fact that our overall income has dropped and will be dropping fairly significantly. More about that in a moment or two. And we've been engaging in a whole series of national meetings, meetings of diocesan secretaries, meetings of finance directors, meetings of this, that, and the other, with other dioceses. So trying to keep in touch with what other people are doing and what's going on. In the bishop's leadership team, some of the archdeacons have been engaging with resilience hubs, both on a county level and more local level. There's been a lot of ringing around and writing to the clergy by bishops and archdeacons. And actually, I've personally found that hugely encouraging and stimulating, actually. Had some wonderful conversations with a whole variety of people. There have been a lot of Zoom meetings, of which this is one. And there's been a little bit of online input from Bishop Emma and me, for instance, at Ascension and Pentecost, and a fairly regular commentary on Radio Cumbria, who've been really, really good during this period and have been keeping people in touch with what's going on, and lots of conversations taking place. We're very fortunate, I think, to have Radio Cumbria and the people like Richard Corrie and Helen Millican, who've been doing a great job on keeping people in touch with what's going on. The whole Vision Refresh process has been continuing, and we'll be hearing more about that in just a moment from Bishop Emma. And we have, for the moment, as a diocese, put a freeze on external stipendiary appointments of clergy, and instead of making interim appointments and appointments of people internally until the situation becomes a bit clearer. There are one or two people who are already in the pipeline who'd already been appointed who will be taking up their posts soon, but for the most part, we're doing interim things until we're a bit clearer on where things are going. And we have established a task group to advise both Bishop's Council and this Diocesan Synod. And that will be reporting in September, I hope. And I'll be talking a bit more about that, the task group, and what it's for and what it's doing in a moment or two. One of the things that all of us are engaged in is trying to think a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned, and the key question really of what the church in future is going to look like, what the new normal will be. At the moment, we don't really know. So it's going to be quite an interesting time. And I think there's going to be a lot of both and rather than either or when we come to answering that question. So that's a rundown on what's been going on nationally and where we are more locally, and quite when we will be back to churches being open to anybody to come in at any time and to all worship together. I don't know. I really do not know. But we're hoping that the beginning of that process will be next month, July. Well, that's me. And we're going to move over now. I hope people are sending in their questions to Dave. I've seen one or two flashing up there. I haven't answered them yet because I'll wait till the question and answer time. But we're moving on now to the God for All Vision Refresh briefing. And this is going to be Bishop Emma and Kerry Rowden, who will fill us in with where we're getting to and how things are going.
Thank you very much, Bishop James. I think we're going to share a screen with you now, which will have a presentation on it, which I'm just going to talk through relatively briefly. But before we do that, I don't know, I totally agree with what Bishop James was just saying about the stress of so many Zoom calls. And I thought you might enjoy, I've been noting some of the vocabulary that we've been developing over the past few months of lockdown. And so here are some phrases for you. What we've been on over the last few weeks has been a Corona coaster. We don't do blue sky thinking anymore, we do like blue Skype thinking. When we get a little bit stressed and we have that extra glass of wine, we can call it furlough Merlot. And we no longer talk about the elephant in the room, it's the elephant in the Zoom. And over tea time with my family this evening, somebody said something negative and somebody else said, don't be such a prophet of Zoom. So, you know, we have a whole new vocabulary that we can muster in these days. But I just wanted to begin this Vision Refresh presentation by echoing a couple of phrases that I heard from Bishop James' reflection at the start of our time together. One of the things he said is that we are trusting fully in God for the eventual outcome. And I thought that was a really good phrase for us to take into the whole meeting, but this section in particular. And he also said something about God bringing good things out of bad. And as we look a little bit at the vision refresh and where we are, I think having that kind of hope-filled vision that even though this is a hard time that we're in, God is going to use the opportunities to bring something good out of this for him is just is really worth us keeping in mind. So I've got some slides. Please do continue to ask your questions in the Q&A section, and we can have a discussion, as it were, at the end of the time together. So Vision Refresh. Some of you will have heard this before, some of you this will be completely new, so we might be joining this at different points at the journey. So I thought it might be quite helpful for us just to hear about the story so far. So in case you're wondering where we are on the Vision Refresh journey, to refresh your minds a little bit, about a year ago, you might have picked up a little card like this in church or in a deanery or diocesan synod meeting. Vision Refresh begins now. And it was around about this time of year, perhaps sort of May time, that we began to think, well, the current God for All Vision period is coming to an end in 2020, and so what next? Where do we go next? And alongside that, we announced 100 days of prayer, and that started about a year ago, almost to the day, about a week ago, a year ago. 100 days of prayer. There was a little prayer that we prayed, and I was really encouraged at the time to sense the way in which the whole county was praying for the Vision Refresh process. And then followed by 100 days of listening. In fact, in the end, it turned out to be 132 days of listening, I think, because we went a little bit longer than we said we would, and we went into January. And you might remember that the main way that listening happened, it happened in all sorts of different ways. There was a leaflet that, just showing you that so you might remember and recognise that's the next screen, which was an attempt to sort of say, well, this is where we are. This is what some of the emphases of God for All have been up to this point, working ecumenically, reimagining ministry, emphasising mission, establishing fresh expressions and forming mission communities. And on the back of that piece of work, there was an online survey which you could fill in. And if we could just have the next slide, Dave. So between September 2019 and January 2020, I think actually well over 1,500 people and groups of people. And that ranged from everything from deanery, diocesan synods, individuals to our church schools. Some of the children in our church schools also participated in the survey. So there was an online survey where you were asked to rank your top 4 priorities out of a possible 10. And there was also a little box that allowed you to say anything else that you wanted to say. And so if you were somebody who filled in that survey, thank you very much. That was not for nothing. The fruits of that piece of work are now what we see before us. And so out of that survey, 6 things floated to the top. And these were the 6 things that we said, that we wanted to take forward into the future. Quite high came a wanting to focus on care for God's creation and the environment. We said that we wanted to have a greater focus on mission through social action. We said we wanted to deepen discipleship, helping people follow Jesus more closely in all aspects of life. We said we wanted to help local churches to pray and to listen better, both to God and to their local communities. We said we wanted to continue actually to develop fresh expressions of church, connecting with people who are under or unrepresented in our churches. And we said we wanted to increase our focus on evangelism in the everyday by helping individuals to share their faith in Jesus. So those were the top 6 that came out of that Vision Refresh survey. And then you might notice, if you are very Anglican and know a lot about the 5 marks of mission, or can cite them off the top of your head, in which case a prize later, that those top 6 correlate quite closely actually with what we see in the 5 marks of mission, which was an attempt by the whole Anglican Communion actually about 30 years ago to articulate what it means to be a church and how we talk about the mission of the church. And the 5 marks of mission are these. We've just got a slide with those on for those of you who can't recall it instantly without thinking a little about it. To teach, baptize and nurture believers, to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth, to respond to human need by loving service and to transform unjust structures of society, and to respond, I've put the same twice. So there's a prize at the end. I will literally send some chocolate to somebody who reminds me which one I am missing there. But it doesn't matter, because we will come on to the next slide, which is that the top 6 outcomes and those 4 marks of mission can be gathered up, I think, under 4 broad themes. 4 broad things come out of both of those sets of priorities. An emphasis on discipleship, an emphasis on evangelism, an emphasis on creation care, and an emphasis on social action. We will come back to those 4 in just a moment, so hold that thought. The 100 Days of Listening survey also enabled people to identify other things that they thought we needed to focus on. And a gathering up of the things that came out of that box provides a really helpful set of cross-cutting themes, if you like. These are things that might cut through the whole vision and be found through everything we do, that we don't want to lose sight of as we develop a new vision and strategy. So young people, families and schools. Ministry, how we structure and focus the ministry of everyone in the church. Doing everything ecumenically, that's very much the hallmark of us here in Cumbria and continues to be a cross-cutting theme. Questions about what we do with our buildings and how we best use them for the mission of God. Some thoughts about communications and technology, and actually this has probably taken on a whole new focus really since the lockdown, since we've all been using technology in new and different ways. And then something about an emphasis on a mixed ecology of different kinds of ways of being church in our mission communities. We also, as a Bishop's Council a few months ago, suggested a possible set of values that we might want to accompany any refreshed vision. So as we talk about what we're going to do together, how do we also talk about how we're going to be together? And what are some of the values? Bishop James talked about the fruits of the Spirit earlier. What are some of the ways of doing things that we might want to think about? And this here is just a set of some of the words that we came up with that we would like to continue to be together. Hopeful, honest, faithful, kind, loving, thankful, courageous, and joyful. So that's a little bit of background, and I'd now just like to talk you through where we've got to in terms of framing all that in a way that we can catch hold of and take forward and develop some strategy around. And in a very short moment will be a chance for you to be interactive with this. So how about if we grouped those four, if we termed those four priorities that I just mentioned to you under the following phrases. To follow daily, that's about discipleship. To care deeply, that's about our response in social action to our communities and the world in which we live. To speak boldly, which is about evangelism and mission and the way we speak about our faith. And to tread gently, which is about our place in God's created world. We'll come back to all of those in just a minute, but I want you to focus for a second on that central circle, God for all. That's what the strategy is called at the moment. But there is a question around, I think, and there isn't yet an answer to this. This is where we want some feedback from you. Do we continue to call what we do together God for all? Or are some of the changes that we're going to be talking about, does that mean that we actually need to think about a different title instead of God for all? So here are some of the things that have been suggested that we could do. We could continue with God for all. We could call it God for all and add all for God, which if God for all is the sort of mission side of it, all for God is the discipleship side of it. Somebody the other day in a meeting suggested that we change just one word and we maybe talk about God with all instead of God for all. Another option that somebody mentioned to me the other day, Cumbria for Christ. That's a phrase we could think about calling the vision and strategy that. Or there's another one, living hope in Cumbria. Hope is going to be quite an important word going forward, I think. Do we want to get this sort of phrase in there somewhere? Or something else entirely? Here is your chance to vote. So I'm not sure how this happens technically, Dave, but a poll is about to appear somewhere and you can vote on which option. Oh, there you are. There it is right there. Hopefully you can see that before you. From now until the end of this presentation, you could vote, if you like, on which one of those options that I've just talked about you prefer. Now, I do need to say at this point, this is not Eurovision, and we will not have an outright winner at the end of this evening. We will announce to you the result of the poll, but there are various other processes of consultation that we might want to go through. So this is just to get a sort of sense of where you might be thinking. What do you think we should call this thing, this vision and strategy thing? Have a go and put in your vote at the point that you would like to, as to which one of those, or something else entirely, you would like to go for. So that's where we are with that central circle. Just for a couple of minutes, I want to just talk through those four areas in a little bit more detail to give you some thinking, some of the thinking behind some of these phrases. And as I do this, I do encourage you to think, how does this land with my church or my local community at the moment? Particularly as we're coming out into what will be a new normal. The world has changed beyond what we ever thought it would do. How does this particular set of vision priorities resonate with you at the moment? And it'd be really good to hear some of that, perhaps in the Q&A at the end. So here's the first thought, follow daily. I think if we could just move the slide on. One, that's brilliant. So follow daily, this is about discipleship. We might describe it like this. We will help each other to follow Jesus more closely, seeking to grow as his disciples in all aspects of life, both corporately and as individuals. And if we want to, there are so many biblical phrases and stories and themes that we could invoke for this, but something like Matthew 16, if you want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. This is about following Jesus daily in everything we do. And that's not just what we do in church, that's what we do Monday to Saturday and all the time. How do we live out and help each other to grow as disciples of Jesus? And then the next one is speak boldly. We've just celebrated Pentecost when we heard about how the disciples were filled with the Spirit and spoke boldly. And all the way through Acts, we see them continuing to do that. So Acts 4:31, they were filled with the Holy Spirit and spoke the word of God boldly. Some of you might have seen over Easter, there was a little social media campaign that Robin Ham started in Barrow, which was under the title, Easter Changed My Life. And it was a chance for Christians just to speak boldly into social media what Jesus had done for them. So how about this? We will share our faith in Jesus Christ in everyday ways. I kind of want to say in brackets, not in weird ways, you know, in everyday, normal, relaxed, confident ways, seeking to connect with everyone, especially those currently unrepresented in our churches. And we'll do this in time-honoured and pioneering ways. And that's quite a deliberate choice of words. We've tended to talk about fresh expressions of church and other kinds of church. Maybe we need to change the language around that a little bit. Maybe we need to start talking about time-honoured ways and pioneering ways. Just a thought. I'd be really interested to hear what you think about that. And then in his reflection at the start, Bishop James talked a lot about service and how we'd learned as a church to serve our communities during this time of lockdown. That's a very biblical concept. Jeremiah 29:7, seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare. This is our connection with our communities, those we live with and amongst. So we will care deeply. Care has become quite a key word over the last few weeks. We clap for carers. We care about what is happening in our communities. So will we continue to listen to our local communities, to respond in loving service, seeking to transform injustice? That's certainly something that is very to the fore at the moment with the Black Lives Matter campaign that we've seen reflected on our screens. To challenge oppression and to pursue peace and reconciliation. And in whichever world, however this world emerges as we come out of lockdown, those are going to be key things that we're going to need to do as a church. Challenge oppression, pursue peace and reconciliation. And then finally, and briefly, to tread gently. Now, hasn't it been lovely during this time of lockdown to see nature blooming in a way that we maybe haven't seen in the past? I know certainly I've watched the tadpoles in my garden pond grow daily, and I've taken time to watch them and to be part of nature. And we were very aware going into the lockdown that we needed to do something about our creation care. We weren't living sustainable lives. I think that's taken on even more of a sharp priority for us as we come out of lockdown. How do we find a new normal in this? Will we strive to safeguard the integrity of God's creation, seeking to sustain and renew the life of the earth? So those are 4 possible themes. Those are the ways that we could think about and frame our vision, who we are as a church going forward. And there's something else that we could do as well. If I just ask Dave to flick on to the next screen. Oh, the next one after that, actually, we'll come back to what you think. You'll notice that for each of those, there's a verb and an adverb. Care deeply, speak boldly, tread gently, follow daily. We could actually use all of those adverbs in relation to all of those verbs. So I think if we click, we can maybe see a clever thing where we can follow gently. We can care daily, speak deeply and tread boldly. And we can do that with each of them. So the whole thing can circulate and we can find a slightly different emphasis in relation to each one of those vision statements. So that's just something to be thinking about. How do we care boldly? If we put all of that together, the next phrase just shows those 4 central themes with the values around the edge. And then we could even go one step further and put the cross-cutting themes around the edge as well. This all looks rather complicated and a bit like a zodiac sign, so we probably wouldn't present it all together like this, but that's just a way of helping you to see everything on one page. What we could do as well also is find ways of helping us to live this out in our daily life. So we might think about developing some holy habits or a rhythm of life, a rule of life that would help us to live it out. It might look something like this. This is an unpopulated structure, but under each of those, what might we do daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, and over a whole lifetime as individuals and communities. And that will be focused around rhythms of spirituality, of prayer, of habits, of ways of doing things. So that's just to sort of float that as an idea. What we would love to know is what you think. And there are a couple of ways that you can respond to this by asking questions in the Q&A at the end, and or sending in any comments, thoughts, reflections to the programme office, which is Kerry's office, Kerry Rowton, who hasn't said anything, but I'll give her a chance to in a second if there's anything that you'd like to add, Kerry, to where we are in the process. It'd be nice for people to hear from you briefly. But that's where we are. You might be asking what happens now. That's a very good question. So what happens now is that the vision refresh process has been reviewed so far by the Bishop's leadership team, by Bishop's Council, and by the ecumenical county senior leaders. And it is now going to go through a sense check process with the following groups: with rural deans, mission community leaders, deanery lay chairs, diocesan synod, and that's what's happening right now, the God for All team, and others that I've probably forgotten and we probably need to talk to, but that's what's going to happen to it now. The refreshed vision we're hoping can be approved and welcomed and adopted by everyone in October. And then the accompanying strategy, about which we'll hear a little bit more in a moment as we talk about the task group work, will be developed over the autumn. There is a reason why the strategy to support the vision has been pushed a little bit further down the line than it might have been otherwise. And that's because we need to work out what the result of, what the impact of COVID is going to be on our finances and on our ways of doing things. So we need a bit longer to develop the strategy, because we can't do that right now because we're coming into a very changed world. So that's why that's slightly separated, but Derek and others might say more about that in a moment. That's probably more than enough from me, apart from to say, please keep praying. A couple more phrases from Bishop James' presentation at the start. In that prayer, you prayed that we would expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. I think that both of those, I would want to say, frame the way we see the vision refresh. So Kerry, I don't know if there's anything, is there anything that you wanted to add about process or where we go from here, or do you just want to wave and say hi? But I don't think we can hear you, Kerry. Can anybody else hear? I'm not sure your sound's coming through, but you're unmuted. Oh,
Can you hear me now? Brilliant. My microphone was selected to a different one on our computer, so I apologise for that. But it was first of all really just to say hello. I've met many of you during this vision refresh process. I read all of the responses that people submitted when we did the 100 days of listing, so I probably feel like I know you a little more than you feel like you know me. So it was great to read through those. As Bishop Emma said, I'm very much involved in the process of supporting the vision refresh through, and there's not a lot more to add to that really, because Bishop Emma has taken us through where we are with that. You know, it is carrying on. We are looking at this vision refresh, and the process is carrying on throughout all of the impact of COVID-19 and things that are going on at the moment. So really that was all from me really, just to say hello.
thank you very much, Kerry. And thanks everybody for listening to that. I think we now hand over to the task group, and we're going to hear a bit about the task group presentation.
Bishop James, you're not, you're still muted.
Thank you, Dave. This is going to be one of the the ongoing phrases, isn't it, from this period? You're on mute. Now, the task group. This is, I mentioned the task group earlier on, and this is an important new group. It's been set up by the diocese, and its aim is to help us achieve financial sustainability in support of our mission, everything that we're hoping to do as part of Vision Refresh, our ministry, and everything that's going to be involved in this ecumenical county post-COVID-19. And the Financial Planning Task Group has been set up by Bishops' Council. It's going to focus on long-term sustainability and ways of growing the church, continuing to grow the church in every way in this diocese and in this county. Now, you'll know, and I referred to this a little earlier on, that along with every other diocese in the Church of England, nobody is exempt from this. Our cash flow and overall financial situation has been badly hit by the coronavirus pandemic. And Jim will be saying more about this in just a moment. But you'll know that almost every part of our income has been affected. Since church buildings have been closed, regular giving has fallen, parish offer's been affected, fundraising things haven't happened, investment income is likely to be lower because of fallen stock market, parochial fees haven't been earned, as many of the occasional offices that have been planned haven't happened. And we have a certain amount of property which is let out to commercial and residential tenants, and they themselves are under financial pressure, so we may not get all the money that we would have liked. And just in case that wasn't enough, we've even had weeks and weeks of fine weather, which means that our hydro scheme hasn't been performing as well as it normally does. I dare say that's all going to change soon, but we shall see. In comparison with other dioceses, I should stress the fact that actually we are in quite a good position. We have higher levels of liquidity, and the fact that our finances have been so extraordinarily well managed, not least by Rick and Derek and the Board of Finance in recent years, has made our position stronger, much stronger than it would otherwise have been. But that doesn't alter the fact that this is a very challenging time, and Rick and Derek are working on developing financial models which take into account the level of impact of the virus this year and in subsequent years. And they're producing a best case, medium case, and worst case scenario. And I dare say Jim will be saying something about that. I have to say that from my point of view, even the best case doesn't look very best. It's quite alarming. In financial terms, our primary aim as a diocese is to balance our budget as soon as we possibly can so that we can maintain missional support for the long term. And the whole business of growing the church, growing disciples, of being true to our vision and the vision refresh right across the county is the absolute priority. And that's the context within which the task group is working. It's going to develop financial plans for each of those scenarios that I mentioned. And with its priority to work out how we can resource the whole process of the vision refresh and strategy. And so Bishop Emma is sitting on the task group to make sure that we take a consistent approach, both across vision refresh and the work of the task group. I'm chairing the task group. It's made up of 11 members, including Bishop Emma and various representatives from Bishop's Council and the Diocesan Board of Finance team. And it'll look to propose priorities for expenditure to support the refreshed vision. It'll look at levels of and models of ministry, an ongoing process. We've already been doing a bit of that. And activities to enable and support mission and identify where savings can be made. And alongside this, and this is actually quite important, the DBF is going to review the overall diocesan financial model, including how parishes currently contribute towards the costs of ministry. We will be looking at that model and thinking about ways in which it may need to be changed in the future. Obviously, time is critical in all of this. The plan is, as I indicated earlier, the task group will report to Bishops' Council in September with costed plans based on each scenario. Those plans will then go before all of us, Diocesan Synod, in October, though at the moment we have no idea whether we're going to be able to meet in person or perhaps again like this. Meanwhile, the 3 archdeacons, who are also our strategy development officers, are working very closely with rural deans, with lay chairs, with mission community leaders, with local clergy and others, as we begin to consider what models of ministry and mission may look like. We're already actually quite a long way down this track with our whole mission community pattern. And the COVID thing has simply exacerbated some of the trends that were already underway. Now, the group can and no doubt will make recommendations for changes to our current ecumenical strategies. We've got ecumenical strategies at the moment, as you know, for ministry, for outreach, and for buildings. But if they do suggest any changes, those will obviously need to be considered by our ecumenical partners, and we're in close contact with, discussion with the other ecumenical leaders and others. In terms of overall consultation and engagement, beginning to happen at deanery level and within mission communities, we're going to need to consult about all of this at all sorts of different levels, including Diocesan Synod, deanery synods, mission communities, and PCCs. The coronavirus pandemic, as we're all very well aware, has given us all any number of challenges, and the waters we're sailing through at the moment are basically uncharted. I guess we're all very conscious of all the people in this county and further afield, our own relatives, perhaps some friends in other parts of the country and around the world, who've lost their lives as a result of contracting this virus. We're probably all of us in touch with people who've been bereaved. We know people who are battling their way back to health. We know and are in touch with people who are either already without work, who've been made redundant, or face a very uncertain future in terms both of work and finance. And some of the figures, I mean, I said I've just come out of a seminar with various very senior figures in this country. They're talking about the possibility of 11% unemployment by the end of this year, which is absolutely massive. And we're also very conscious of all the wonderful people, and this is not only in the NHS, there especially, but also you know, in other places, in care homes and so on, who are putting their own safety to one side as they're caring for the sick and the vulnerable. I mentioned earlier that the figures that are being given to us of people who say they are praying during this period are enormous. The latest I saw was 25% of the population, which is remarkable if it's true. I don't know whether it's true or not, but certainly a lot of people are asking big questions at the moment. A lot of people are rethinking what life is all about, why we're here, and where they're going. And a number are going to be wanting to explore their faith now and later. And we're very conscious of the fact that while our church buildings may have been closed, churches are still very much alive. And I talked a little bit about the way in which we're trying to reach out to people who need help and support, not only members of our congregations, but members of our communities, the communities that we are there to serve. And all of it motivated by and rooted in our Christian faith. And so please do pray for this task group. They've got a difficult job, but a very important one. They are doing their best and will be doing their best to help us with everything that we're trying to do to grow as churches and as disciples ecumenically right across Cumbria. And we're very grateful to the people who are members of it. I think that's all I'm going to say about the task group. If you've got questions, please do add them to the questions that are already stacking up there. We're well ahead of time, which is good. It gives me the opportunity to hand over for a little while to Jim Johnson, who is chair of the Diocesan Board of Finance. We'll be saying a little bit about our financial situation and response to it, and then we'll have a little bit more time, hopefully, for the questions at the end. Jim, over to you.
You need to unmute yourself, Jim.
Here we are. So good evening, everybody. You can see me and I can't see you. And I'm not sure who's better off as a result of that. What is brilliant is to see that there are 77 participants in this format, 11 of whom are visually in front of you, but that leaves 66 who have tuned in. And it's very important that you have, because what you've heard may not be a conventional diocesan synod, but it really gets to the meat of what we're about at the moment. And although this is a finance section, I would emphasize that the finance is here to serve what we're here for, not the other way around. So the vision refresh is the important thing. Getting that right is important, and resourcing it, obviously, as well as we can, with the limited amount of resources that we have, is what we, through the task force as well, are now about. You would normally have been having a diocesan synod, at which point you'd have had our minutes of the previous meetings, we'd have had an AGM with the audited accounts, and we'd have reappointed the auditors and all the stuff that normally happens in June. And obviously, Church House has been shut. Various people have been working from home. And the audit, obviously, has not been able to take place in full. Some bits can be done remotely, but most of it, which is done on site, can't be achieved. So all that's now been put back, and we'll be dealing with that at the October Synod. We can do that by law. We're allowed to do that. We can get an extension on that. So that bit of the business we're not dealing with at all tonight. I'd like to show a slide, please, Dave, which reminds us of our diocesan structure. Now, those of you who've been on Diocesan Synod for a while will have heard me say a bit of this before, but I think it's important to remind ourselves, because we're in a slightly different mode here. Bishop's Council has had a very, very important role to play in responding to the situation that we now find ourselves in. And we had the Diocesan Board of Finance obviously keeps its eye on the finances, but we can't set the strategy. Bishop's Council does recommend the strategy to you, the Diocesan Synod. You are also the members, as in the shareholders, although you don't actually have shares, there's no value there. You're the members of the Board of Finance. So those three, Diocesan Synod, Bishop's Council and Diocesan Board of Finance, basically are the management team for the diocese. And the democracy works through the right-hand column, which is that parishioners elect the PCCs, who elect the deanery synods, who elect the diocesan synods. And if the communication works both ways down that right-hand side, then the communication needs to work very well also up and down the left-hand side and between the left and the right-hand sides. So it's a triangle of responsibilities. And this crisis that we're in has emphasized the need for that to work very well, because the Diocesan Synod is the approval body for everything we do. You approve our budget. You approve the mission and ministry strategies, and the vision refresh will come before you for approval too. So you actually have a real job to do. And sometimes it may seem you sit in rooms and get talked to, but actually, I think that chart shows quite strongly, or hopefully it does, that the Diocesan Synod is right at the top of the pyramid. And we do rely on you for wise judgment to support what we recommend to you. Now, the task force sits between the Bishop's Council and the Diocesan Board of Finance, represented almost equally by members of each. And that's essential. And I think it's probably the first time in my experience that we've had this active link between the two influences. One organizes the strategy, and the second organizes how much of it and what with can be delivered. Now that's good, and it's as far as I want to go with that. But it might be worth looking at the components of our diocese. And if you look down the Diocesan Board of Finance block there, yeah, you've got trustees who are elected by the Diocesan Synod. And they also have the archdeacons in there and the bishops and the church officers as well. We're the corporate and charitable vehicle for the diocesan and for the board of for the diocese and for the Board of Education. We manage the financial resources, but we can't control how much of it we have, because, as Rick will go on to say, the lion's share of it comes from parish offer. He'll be saying more about that, I'm sure. But the parishes aren't having an easy time of it at the moment. And going down, there are quite a lot of aspects to what we have and hold as a diocese, and subsidiary activities like Rydal Hall and the hydro schemes and the Academy Trust and the op shops. And we're a trustee of 106 diocese schools. And we manage all the human resources and the payroll and the diocesan administration and the properties, both active and investment. So we've got 120 actively occupied houses, and we've got another 70 that are surplus to requirement or rented out in case we need them in the future. And one of our jobs as a DBF is to take a rigorous look at the assets that we have and say, are they actually producing what they could in terms of income? And if not, is there another form of income that could generate more, conscious of the fact that the key income element of parish offer is and continues to drop quite severely. And we have to find means of replacing that somewhere else, or we can't deliver the strategy. And that's the scenario that we're in. I would like you now to turn to Rick, because he's going to take us through what we know and what we also don't yet know about the financial situation facing us.
Hey, thanks, Jim. Good evening, everyone. From the new temporary Diocesan Finance Head Office, known as Rick's Spare Room. I've been asked just to give you a quick snapshot of how things are at the moment, what we do know, what we don't know, how things are beginning to look for the future. Some of these things have been alluded to already, so forgive me if there's a bit of repetition. There are so many aspects of the coronavirus affecting so many things that we do. As people, it affects us in so many different ways. My job is to think about the financial aspect of that. So I have to park the rest for now. From a financial aspect, coronavirus is having an enormous impact around the world financially, in this country, in this county. And we, as members of the DBF Finance Committee, have to understand that, and we'll ultimately have to make tough decisions around what we find out. I can give you a snapshot of how it looks now. When we meet again in October, life will have moved on, we'll know a lot more, but there'll still be a lot of unknown elements to it. What we do know is that this is impacting finances at all levels. The individual members of our congregations are being impacted in terms of health, in terms of fear, in terms of wanting to or not wanting to venture out, and in terms of personal finances. It's strange that some people are sitting at home with their income coming in and nothing to spend it on, while others are not sure where the next meal is going to come from. It's a really strange and divisive virus in so many ways. We know it's having a big impact on PCC finance, the collections, the envelope schemes, fundraising, parochial fees, events, room hire. I could go on all the ways in which PCC finances are being hit. And we don't know, they don't know how quickly congregations will be able to come back and when they'll feel willing to come back. The diocese, both ours and around the country, are being impacted because our main source of income is the parish offer, which ultimately comes from our congregations giving generously to their churches. The national church itself is being impacted. Much of its income is investment. And again, with world economics plunging into recession, those are all going to be hit heavily. So there's a lot to be concerned about. It will have a big impact on this year, which we will look a little bit about the mitigation that we're trying to do around that. In some ways, one difficult year with some reserves you can get through. Probably our main concern is the longer term, medium and long term impact of this. What will next year look like? What will 5 years' time look like? And that's what we're really trying to think through now. The task group will be, considering that very deeply. In terms of 2020 so far, I'll just give you a snapshot as to some of the things we do know. Parish offer, which represents something like 75% of our unrestricted income, and every penny of which is spent on local ministry, as you often hear me say. So far, that's dropped between 11 to 13% in April and May on last year. That's something like £100,000 less than we received in those 2 months last year. So that's a big number. Our concern is that will grow the longer that churches are closed for worship, as PCCs start to run down their reserves, as treasurers start to hit the panic button. We suspect that will accelerate the longer the congregations are kept out of the churches. We know that parochial fees obviously are being hit significantly. We hope and pray that churches are using the stewardship resources. Sophie Hodge, our stewardship enabler, is doing the most amazing job in giving access to lots of different ways of reaching out to congregations, just seeking that's financial support, but in a sensitive way to what we're going through. And I'd really encourage your churches, your PCCs, to link in with that work that Sophie's been doing. We're really appreciative of the support that we are getting from PCCs. Some have given us their entire year's parish offer in advance to help us, which is great. We've had many individuals giving us additional money, gifts and grants as well, which is wonderful. We also know that some PCCs are already struggling and can't pay. A PCC can't pay if it doesn't have money. So the whole raft of scenarios out there that our churches are facing. Investment income, as been alluded to already, is going to be under a lot of pressure. 2020 doesn't look as bad as we first feared, which is good. CCLA, who are our investment managers, have intimated that this year they probably are going to maintain their dividend on the investment fund. Many of the PCCs have money in those, and that's good news. We know that interest rates are virtually not there, and the property fund, where some of the diocesan funds are being held, is going to be reduced, but we knew that anyway because of some regulatory changes. So 2020 actually, from an investment income, is perhaps a little better than we feared it was going to be, but we are very concerned about 2021 and beyond. That figure of 11% unemployment that Bishop James just mentioned, the prospect of some years of recession, etc., that will all have impact on investment income, which will materially impact our income as a diocese and give us less money to spend. It will rain again. It is raining again, so the hydro schemes will continue to deliver. That's one thing we can be assured of. And rental income so far has been holding up, but again, the recession could impact that in the future. Rydal Hall closed very quickly back in March. We've effectively mothballed the site. We have staff to look after because it's their home in some cases, and we're trying to minimise the losses that we're going to face. We'd hope for a break even there this year. It's going to be a significant loss. Again, we're trying to do everything that we can to reduce that loss, and are hopeful that the government might continue support of the hospitality industry going forward. We are doing a lot to try and mitigate the potential losses in the diocese. We've identified as much spend that is, you call it discretionary. Some of it's mission activity, project activity that the God for All team would be doing. Some of it's repair work on clergy housing, which can be put off for a while. There are other savings being made, but they're all painful. We're furloughing staff in Church House, in the op shops, in Rydal Hall as much as possible, and the ongoing use of that government support is helpful. We have a voluntary redundancy scheme in place for diocesan staff, which is out at the moment, and the temporary freeze on external recruitment as well, which has been mentioned. That will save quite a considerable amount of money, but we will still make a substantial loss this year, almost inevitably. The other thing just to update you on is some of the conversations that we've been having with the national church, who are keen to support dioceses. We've had some very engaging conversations with them. Bishop James alluded to, there are some dioceses who are literally down to their last pennies. We were very blessed to make some property sales in February and March, which means that from a cash point of view, we're okay, which is great. That said, it's money that normally we would have invested, which would then earn us money for next year and the year after and the year after. So it's painful that we're going to have to spend that to get ourselves through this, but rather be in that position than the others. We have some the initial support from the National Church was about liquidity, keeping dioceses afloat who weren't going to. The good news is that a lot of us have been lobbying them that their support needs to be considered and thoughtful to bring about sustainability and change for long-term good. And the good news is we think they're hearing it. Time will tell, but we are getting some encouraging noises around that. You can waste a lot of money in a crisis by just throwing it where people shout the loudest. And so we're going to be working really hard. We've got another call tomorrow, I think it is, or Thursday, on that with the National Church. So wait and see, but we'll keep you up to date on that. That's 2020. I don't know what the final loss will be, but we will be doing everything we can to minimise that. The scenarios going forward, we're just about to redo them because life has moved on a little, but we had the best, mid and worst cases, as has been mentioned. And over those 3 years, they range from, and brace yourselves, 3 million to over £6 million of losses. We did nothing other than face the pain of less income. Now, that's not an option. We haven't got reserves like that. So the work of the task force, as those scenarios get adjusted, they'll be a little bit better based on this year so far, but there's so many unknowns in terms of the next few years. But once we start to get a feel for what the future does look like, then we will be prepared to start making thoughtful decisions about it. And that's very much what the task group is about, what tonight is about in slot. It's just planting those seeds of, we are in for change. We are going to be hit by this in a material and significant way. But it does give us opportunities to make thoughtful decisions. If we start to plan now, and that's what we're doing, it means that when we know which scenario, what is the final answer, or when we start finding out which direction it's going, we can then make the decisions because we've already thought about it. We've already gone through the pain barrier in some cases of working out what we can afford to do and what we can't afford to do. But that's very much the work of the next few months as we continue to focus on this. We mustn't make knee-jerk reactions, but we mustn't suddenly we mustn't spend too long mulling over it either, because you can lose a lot of money while you think. So that's why the pace has been set quite thoughtfully to last over these next few months. We are aiming to get back to a break-even budget because this diocese has always worked on that basis, and that's why we are in the strong position relative to others that we are. And the DBF feels that is right to continue to do that. Otherwise, we just slowly shrink and do less each year. So that's going to be a tough journey to get through. Those actions have to start in 2021 with the aim of a balanced budget by 2022. It's a tough and necessary task that we've got to do. There's lots to be thankful for. There's lots to be hopeful for. We've seen amazing generosity already. Some fantastic PCCs and treasurers who are engaged, who are thinking about it, who are exploring contactless giving and online giving and all these things. So there are real signs of hope amongst the difficulties that we're facing. And the challenge for us now is to work together at local, national and diocesan level to find a way forward through this together, to come out with a strong, vibrant and sustainable church. Sounds easy, doesn't it? That's our snapshot. I'm sure there'll be a few questions pinging in. I think I hand back to Jim at this stage.
Thanks, Rick. I don't know about you folk watching out there, but I'll add Derek into this comment. But I thank myself daily that I've got Rick and Derek as wise counsel sitting there doing the jobs that they're doing, because we are in safe hands, and we should be very grateful for that and not forget it. Well done both. So you've seen a little bit about where we're at, and the reality is we really don't know enough about where we're heading at the moment. What we do know is that through prudent operations in the past few years, we've managed to maintain a little war chest. But that war chest, probably most of it, if not all of it, will go this year. We're still at best, middle and worst case scenarios. We're not sure exactly what the future holds. And this is in no way a chastisement, it's just a reality. But we've mentioned parish offer a couple of times. The reality is that at 2009 levels, we can now buy 60% of what we could in 2009 through parish offer. And somehow or other, we've had to try and bridge those gaps. We've been able to do it in part by a rationalisation at the coalface in terms of number of ministerial posts and the houses associated with them. But there's not too far that we could go down that track without substantially changing the methods of delivery. And obviously, whether we'll be able to maintain or have to adapt, we just don't know yet, because we don't know the scale of the issues that we're facing. But we're on the case as much as we can be. We're linking with the national diocese, most of whom are in either the same situation or worse than we are. So I think that's all we have to say about finance at the moment. Please keep paying what you can. We're trying to do all we can at the centre to economise, rationalise, but at the same time, we're not pressing panic buttons. We've got time to be able to work this out. But we are determined not to just carry on spending what capital we have, because that means that you have less income coming in from it the year after and the year after and the year after, and you really are on a sliding way to nowhere. So we have to try and retain what strength we have in order to fund the risks of the future. And we just hope there isn't going to be another spike, because at the moment we're not legislating for that. So we'll hope we're all up and running quickly. We don't know that yet. That's one of our big risks. But sorry, on that down note, I'm going to say thanks for turning up. There's still 75 in the frame. It's brilliant. Many thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Just to move on now to what will be the questions sessions. So obviously you've heard their presentations on Vision Refresh, Task Group, Finances. Thank you so much for sending the questions to date. I want to start on some practical questions really for Bishop James, if that's okay. Bishop James, we've got a question here from Dave Sargent. Thank you, David, who throws one about supervision. Could we clarify the requirement or not for supervision at open churches? Dave thinks he heard Bishop James mention supervised or safe, but he may have misheard something as he was getting the audio connected. So
he did. Thank you very much. I have had quite a lot of correspondence on this particular topic, and supervised private prayer, which really means having somebody around who's able to make sure that people don't go and touch things that they shouldn't, or are able to be properly socially distanced, was and remains the advice of the national church for all churches in the country. It was originally in the government advice, but going back to a previous comment, it's got lost somewhere along the way in the government advice, so there is a slight difference between the two. In this diocese, our advice is that where possible, it is good to have private prayer supervised. But the circumstances of all our churches are different. The aim of supervision is that people should be kept safe. And I said earlier on that everything that we're doing is about serving other people, not just doing what we want to do. And so if, having discussed it very carefully with your PCC, you are persuaded that you can put into place measures which are going to make sure that people are safe and are not creating problems for others, that's fine. It is your discretion. But many churches are going down the track, particularly rural churches, of saying, well, we can have somebody there at 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock each day, or we can have somebody there on Wednesdays from whatever, and are going down the track of advertising those times as the times it's appropriate for people to come in. The general principle of people simply wandering in and wandering around the church is one that we're trying to avoid if we can, because all sorts of things get touched there, and we're very concerned about the way in which the virus can be passed on. So the answer is, this is advice. It's not a rigid rule. Circumstances of churches are different. But please, please, in anything you're doing in terms of opening a church for private prayer, make sure that every conceivable thing is done that can be done to ensure the safety of the people who use it.
Thanks, Bishop James. Staying with practicalities around church reopening and lifting of restrictions, Mark Wilson has touched on memorial services, and Mark's asked, might we hold memorial services in August? Some Christian families have not been able to mourn a relative through this period in an official sense. And I know that's part of the long-term phased reopening. Bishop James.
Yeah, once again, I'm afraid at the moment we don't have an answer to that. We are hoping that in July we may be able to return to public worship in churches, even with a limited number of people. Now, that limited number of people for many of our churches would be a target rather than a limit. So it may not be a huge problem all around. But if that's the case, then yeah, hopefully we could have memorial services with up to a certain number of people in our churches in August. But if it's not the case, and if, for instance, there's another spike or who knows, then, you know, we'll be making it absolutely clear to people what the situation is. But there will be a lot of memorial services going on at some stage, I'm quite sure.
Okay, thank you for that. Turning to some questions around the vision refresh, Bishop Emma, Tim Barker, hiya Tim, asks, how high on the list of priorities for our vision would you put the question of what we call it? Bear in mind we've just had the poll, and hopefully the poll's closed and we'll be able to bring the results on that. Bishop Emma, how important's the name?
It's kind of not important and very important, isn't it? I mean, in a sense, really, what we call it doesn't matter. It's neither here nor there. However, you'll know that your name stands for something, and what we call it is important because it helps us to understand what we're about together. And it needs to be something that we can remember. It needs to be something that we can pass on to others. It needs to be something that says something about the vision and the way we see it. So I kind of feel, you know, both and in your question. It is very important, but it's not possibly the most important thing. What we actually do is the most important thing. never mind what we call it, but I'm very interested to see how the poll came out at the end of this time.
Thanks for that. A question from Charles Hope, who asks, while the revision refresh is being reviewed and approved by all the Anglican structures to grassroots and ecumenical church leaders, are the other churches reviewing it at the different levels that we are doing?
So I'm going to say a very simple yes, and then I'm going to hand over to Kerry to tell us a little bit about how that's being taken up in the other denominations.
Yes, so the Methodist superintendents are also looking at the vision refresh. That's going out to their circuit councils too, so they're looking at it very much in a similar way to us. The URC have their area pastoral committee, so they'll be looking at this. The Salvation Army structures, I'm talking about covenanted partners here, the Salvation Army structures are slightly different, so they'll be looking at it with their Salvation Army officers, and then we'll be having a space as well in our strategy steering group to bring together sort of feedback and discussions around that from all the different denominations, and that has representation from our covenanted partner and also companion churches too. So it is being discussed in a wide variety of places. I would say that ourselves and the Methodists are discussing it the most amongst their sort of down to the different levels and the grassroots levels there.
Thanks, Kerry. Just a couple of comments that we've received about the Vision Refresh, the presentation that you've heard tonight. Julia Powley, thanks Julia, who says she loves the time-honoured and pioneering phrase that Bishop Emma you've adopted. Biddy likes the gentleness of the Vision Refresh as described tonight. And a question from Alan Bing. Thank you, Alan. Who says, thanks for a very clear presentation on the Vision Refresh. I hope we could all support the 4 priorities that have been identified. Will we be given resources and ideas to help us to develop and implement them? Also, I hope we can continue the emphasis on prayer and openness to God's leading that undergirded the Vision Refresh process, and we'll have the resources and ideas to encourage it. So really, it's prayer and resources, Bishop Emma.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alan. It's a really good question. Yes, I mean, there'd be no point us talking about a vision together and then saying, you know, just go off and do it. It's up to you now. This is going to be what we're about together as a county and as a diocese, and we'll definitely want to make sure that whatever resources parishes need in order to be able to implement them. So some of the work around the task group, around the strategy, obviously that's going to be talking about physical resources, monetary resources, people resources, and how those are best deployed. So that's one kind of resource. There's also going to, I really hope there'll be a whole suite of resources around how we live this out as individuals, as communities, you know, whether that's printed stuff. We've got so much better with technology now, so we can do videos so much easier. And particularly, Alan, I'm really glad you mentioned prayer, because all of this just absolutely, this mustn't be our vision and strategy. This must be what God is calling us to do. And so prayer, I think, is going to be our #1 resource, if you like. And we're very blessed that there's going to be no restrictions or shortage on prayer. We can keep doing that. We can keep praying as much as we like. So I really hope that over the coming year, or sort of 6 months to a year, we'll be developing some really good prayer resources that will help us to keep praying and to keep giving this to God. So yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
Thanks, Emma. Kind of an associated one from Jill Hart, who asks, are the slides of the Vision Refresh presentation available for us to receive and share locally? Now, that's the PowerPoint that Bishop Emma's pulled together. What I will say before I hand over to Bishop Emma is that obviously the session tonight has been recorded and will be made available on the Diocesan YouTube channel, so people can point people, signpost people to that, and we'll be doing that in the e-news as well, so they can certainly watch the presentation given on the Vision Refresh. But Bishop Emma, I don't know whether you want to pick up on anything else.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we begin to talk about this in our churches, and we begin to sort of sense check it with each other. And this evening is just part of that. As I mentioned in the presentation, we're going to be taking this to different groups over the coming few weeks. So area deans, rural deans, lay chairs, mission community leaders. So there will be sort of focused presentations that go with each of those groups. So the presentation I put together was specifically for this group this evening. So rather than just send out this presentation, we might think about sending out a version of it that you can more easily use in the parishes, or that suits particularly talking about it at parish level. So the answer is yes, definitely some form of it will be made available, and as soon as we possibly can. But as Dave said, up till then, please do point people to the video.
That's great, thank you. We've got a number of panelists in the background tonight, and I just wanted to throw this one towards Derek, Diocesan Secretary, if I may. We've had a question in about the furlough scheme, and what will happen to those affected when the furlough scheme is phased out? I don't know whether you can speak to that, Derek, briefly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the point really is that right from the outset, we said we were looking to weigh up or balance, if you like, the business need against the need to save money. So the initial presumption was to furlough as many people as possible, and we did furlough everyone unless their work was immediately essential. And we've got to continue to sort of weigh those things in the balance as the furlough offer from the government gets scaled back, which is starting to happen from the end of this month. So initially, we expect some people are going to return to work part-time in July, and then potentially more people will return in the months after that as the amount offered by the government reduces. And obviously at the end of October, when the scheme comes to an end, everyone will be back at work. That, however, doesn't take any account of the ongoing financial situation. I think it'd be disingenuous of me if I was to suggest that everything is going to carry on completely as it was before. So we are going to have to look at staffing, both because of the financial impact of the pandemic, and also because we need to make sure we've got the right support in place for enabling the vision and the new vision and strategies that's been refreshed. So that looking at the staffing is going to happen partly through the work of the task group that James and Rick talked about, and it'll happen partly as the work on the vision refresh continues in the coming months. And I don't think we'll have made all the decisions about the staffing that's needed actually until we get into 2021. So obviously that's unsettling in some respects, but I think we've just got to work through the process and treat anyone who ends up being affected by the changes in the best possible way that we can.
Thanks, Derek. Staying on a financial theme to a degree, we've had a couple of questions in, one from Ruth Crossley, and this is towards Rick, if at all possible, who says, I've heard a concern that the National Church may just throw money at dioceses without considering how careful they've been in the past. In other words, if you've been good stewards, then you might be in a better position now and then get penalised for it. Is this your view from conversations you've heard? Rick or Derek? I don't know who's best there.
Derek might be slightly better qualified than I, because he's had more conversations. And I think we shared Ruth's view from an early stage. We are fortunate that our position is relatively strong, and it's right that the Church nationally looks at this at all levels, at national, diocesan and parochial level, to work out how together we can get through this. We should, yeah. Ruth's concern is it does run through those dioceses who have been really careful and cautious. The dialogue that's coming out of the Bishop's House is tending now to be looking more, though, at that thoughtful way of supporting dioceses, not just as a bailout, but to fund it through transition. And if that would very much, that's very much what we've been lobbying for, and would be very much supported by us, because whether you've been really strong financially or not so in the past, we're all going to have to go through a period of change from where we've been to where we need to get to, and some of that will need some financing to get us through that transition period. If that's the way the money comes out as support, then I think we will all benefit, and it's the right thing to do. Time will tell. That seems to be the direction of travel. I don't know if Derek's got anything else to add.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is, it's interesting if you look at the effect on parish offer or parish share or quota or whatever they call it in different dioceses, the impact of that has been felt much, much more in the northern province than it has in the southern province. It's probably the reduction in income to dioceses in the province of York in percentage terms is twice as big as it is in the province of Canterbury. And I'm pleased that the conversations I've been having with the church commissioners people, they seem very much to be saying they'll be taking, they won't be doing this on a formulaic basis. So if they've got support to offer, which they will have, there'll be some statistics behind it, but it'll also be on the basis of conversation, so that they actually get a sense of what we've been doing and what we would be doing with money if they were able to support us. But also when it comes to the statistics that will underpin their decisions, two major things that they're taking into account are the relative affluence or not of dioceses. So if a diocese currently gets some low income funding from the church commissioners, that diocese will get more support than one that doesn't get low income funding. And the other thing that they'll look at is historic assets. So Lincoln Diocese, which I understand has an endowment of maybe 150 million quid, probably won't be getting a look in, whereas Liverpool, who have no historic assets whatsoever, would be well up the list for support. So I think they've heard, and we've lobbied pretty hard to say, why should a diocese that hasn't looked after its finances in the past get bailed out, because the incentives there are all wrong. And I think, I don't just think, I know they have listened to that, because I've had specifically conversations with Gareth Mostyn, who's the Chief Executive of the Commissioners, and Philip James, who's the head of their strategy unit, to urge them to look at funding sustainability rather than bailing out basket cases.
Thanks, Derek. Staying on a financial theme, a question from James Richard, who asks, would it be possible to produce a simple picture of the financial situation to be shared with parishioners, so people on the ground are aware of where we're at?
Yeah, I think that's a really great suggestion, James. Funnily enough, we were having a meeting on Zoom, funnily enough, just this afternoon, around the communication of our current position to PCCs and to congregations. And I think that in the same way that last year we produced the financial review, which was trying to demystify diocesan finance as much as possible, I think some sort of resource that churches can use to reiterate that message, but also set it in the context we now face ourselves, I think that would be really helpful. And I've just added it to my to-do list. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a few more questions, and we should aim to be finished just before 9. Just some questions which were pre-prepared and sent in. Thank you to those within Kendall Deanery for doing this. A question from Peter Clark, one of two, which revolves around technology, the use of technology in church and how we move forward with that in the future. And Peter asks, how's the diocese intending to support the exploration of the opportunities and challenges of integrating online worship, teaching, fellowship and witness into the mainstream of church life in the county, recognising that a wide range of organisational, liturgical and canonical issues will arise? Before I hand over, what I will say is we've completed an online worship survey, which many of you have taken part in. Thanks for that, which has shown that at least a third of you have mean to continue with new technology in terms of worship as part of the economy of church in the future. A third of you are going to have discussions about what that will also look like. So there's a real thirst and appetite for it. Bishop Emma, I don't know, would you be prepared to pick up on that?
Yeah, I would. I think this is one of the good things that has come out of a really awful situation that none of us would have wanted. You know, none of us would have wanted this pandemic, but I think we've discovered some things during this time of lockdown, and the trick going forward is going to be, what do we want to continue into the future and to build on, and what do we want to leave behind and never see again? I mean, I know there are certain people who love it if there was never ever another Zoom meeting, but I think probably the reality is that this will be with us for a little while longer, and could be really useful, particularly in a very dispersed county that we're in, with big distances that people have to travel. I really like that list of canonical, liturgical. That was a great list. We all have to think through all of those implications. I think I'd want to add to it theological. There's been quite a lot of theological discussions about whether communion can happen online. I've been part of some of those conversations. So the short answer is yes, we will be including that sort of conversation as we look at the strategy and the vision going forward, and looking to resource well that sort of learning as we move forward with the refreshed vision.
That's great, thank you. And to pick up on what you talk about there in terms of communion and how we do it in the future, there's a question here from Mary exactly about that. What's the thinking about how we receive communion in the future? Bishop James, would you be willing to pick up on that?
Yes, I would. Emma's much more expert on this than I am, but I think people have adopted various different positions on communion during this lockdown. In some cases, clergy have streamed the conduct of a Eucharistic service and have, received bread and wine themselves, and perhaps with their spouse, if they have one, or other members of their family. While, of course, people who are watching can't receive communion themselves. Others have gone for a kind of spiritual fast, which applies to Emma and myself, not receiving communion while other people are not able to. And some have gone for what they call spiritual communion, and I took part in one of these on Sunday. And that involves people reflecting on Jesus, his body, his blood, the sacrament of Holy Communion, but not actually receiving the bread and wine themselves. One thing which I think we will not be doing in the future, certainly this is the case with conversations that have been taking place in the House of Bishops, is having remote Eucharists. In other words, with somebody presiding in their bedroom or, study or something, and everybody else with bread and wine taking it. You could have a kind of agape meal like that, I guess, but not the sacrament of Holy Communion. So I think we are rather looking forward to being able to receive Holy Communion in concrete terms, as it were, together again in the future.
That's great. Thank you very much for that. That basically brings us pretty much to the conclusion of the Q&A session. It's just 5 to 9 now. I thought I'd just leave you with one comment that James Bruce has posted in terms of a vision refresh name. James says, "How about Thy Kingdom Cumbria?" And on that note,
are we going to have the poll answers?
Yes. Are we able to show the poll? Great.
Okay, very interesting. So coming out, this is not Eurovision, this is not the final winner, but interesting to see. So God for All for God comes out 37%. That's the highest, followed by God for All itself, followed by something else, and then Living Hope in Cumbria, God with All, and Cumbria for Christ joint tied on 10%. Very interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking part in that poll. That's a really great sort of snapshot. But I must admit, I do like Thy Kingdom Cumbria. Very nice suggestion, James Bruce. Thank you.
And just to remind everybody that this will be posted onto the Diocesan YouTube channel. Just had a message in from a correspondent to say they missed the start, and was there a question asked about supervision? There was. So we're able to, as soon, we'll look to get this uploaded onto the YouTube channel tomorrow. It'll be signposted in the e-news, and you'll be able to see the answer that Bishop James gave around supervision on there. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Bishop James now for final prayers and the blessing.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you for hosting that, or being the DJ, as it were, and session man. And thank you to all the members of the panel, and thank you to everybody who's asked questions, and to everybody who's been attending this rather unusual synod. I'm going to finish with a blessing. O God, send us out into the world in peace. Help us to hold fast to that which is good. Help us not to return evil for evil. Help us to support the faint-hearted. Help us to support and uphold the weak. Help us to honour all people. O Lord, please help us so to live for Jesus' sake, and bless us this night and always, granting us in our hearts and in our homes your peace, which passes all understanding. And we pray this in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Just goes to me to say thanks very much for attending. Thank you for your questions, your engagement, and the webinar will now come to an end. Thanks so much.